Morena, and welcome to the Dawn Chorus for Friday, January the 24th. I'm Bernard Hickey, and I hope we've solved the sound problems that we had a couple of days ago. Today, I wanted to talk about 6 things around Christopher Luxon's State of the Nation address to the Auckland Chamber of Commerce yesterday at the Cordis. I went along and tried to ask as many questions as I could. Thank you so much for all the questions put through yesterday. And I wanted to go through the announcements in the speech, the thinking behind the Prime Minister's view on growth, what's happening with the science sector, and challenging some of the assumptions that the government is using. Firstly, you might have heard that Christopher Luxon has focused on going for growth in his State of the Nation address and has announced the creation of Invest New Zealand, which is an agency within NZTE designed to bring in foreign investment from sovereign wealth funds. And this would be in the form of investing in, for example, public private partnerships to build motorways and other things. Christopher Luxon says that there's tens of billions of dollars that could be invested in New Zealand infrastructure by these sovereign wealth funds. And he used the example of bringing in foreign investment, so called foreign direct investment, in the likes of Ireland and in Singapore, and compared New Zealand to countries like Ireland and Singapore and Denmark, which have about 5 million people and which are very engaged with the rest of the world, have a lot of foreign investment, do a lot of exporting, and are understandably richer. He says that growing the economy is the only thing he was focused on in the speech, and that it'll be the only thing he's focused on this year. And he also announced, along with Judith Collins, who was there, and she's the outgoing science minister, that the government would abolish Callaghan Innovation and reorganise the 7 Crown Research Institutes into 4 public research organisations. There's about $1.2 billion a year that goes into publicly funded science. This is the old CSIRO and often is designed to invest in pure science and in various applications for science, ways to grow new grass, ways to test sewerage, all sorts of fancy science, which does a lot of public good. Sometimes it gets converted into a useful commercial idea that creates jobs and employment and investment. But the government thinks it doesn't do enough of that, and it is pushing to do a lot more, but with the same amount of money, $1.2 billion. So those were the announcements in the speech. However, I think it's worth challenging some of the assumptions and talking about what wasn't in the speech. So the idea here is that the government is going to grow the economy by reducing government spending as a share of GDP and encouraging others to step forward to fill up the hole. Let's look at the size of the hole. Remember the government's fiscal strategy, its main aim, its North Star, the thing that drives everything, is that it wants to reduce the size of government from about 34% of GDP now to around 30% of GDP within the next 3 or 4 years. And to do that, it needs to get back into surplus and it needs to cut spending aggressively in those areas that it has some control over. Remember, the biggest line in government spending growth is New Zealand superannuation, and the government's not changing that. It also has a bunch of basics, the hospitals still need to be run, the schools need to be run. So it has to really restrict the growth of spending in areas like housing investment, transport investment, health investment, and where they can, reduce the ongoing daily spend. Now, to give you an idea of what 34 to under 30 means, we're talking here of about an economy which is worth about $400 billion, and which is that means that over the next 3 to 4 years, collectively, the government is going to have to cut $64 billion in spending growth. And the idea is that someone else is going to step forward into the gap. And Christopher Luxon made clear his underlying thinking on this is very similar to that used by the national government between 1990 and 1996. His rhetoric is that the government was spending too much. That created inflation. So he got government spending under control. That allowed the Reserve Bank to cut interest rates. And once interest rates are cut, then the economy will grow by itself. Households will borrow money to build new houses and to buy each other's houses and to expand their businesses. And businesses will borrow more money to invest in jobs and growth and exports. That's the theory. And actually, it sort of worked between 1991 2 and the end of the century. We only had one recession or so in 1996, and there was significant growth through the late 90s. Now, that was possible because remember, the government in 1990 inherited an unemployment rate of headed towards 11%. So, simply by employing people who are unemployed, you're able to grow the economy. Secondly, households didn't have much debt in 1990 relative to their incomes. They hadn't borrowed an awful lot to buy each other's houses. In fact, you could buy a house for 2 or 3 times income. And what progressively happened through the 1990s is that there were a lot of farms that borrowed money. Some was to pay for the conversion of sheep farms into dairy farms in Canterbury. We saw a lot of money lent by the banks into the farming sector, particularly dairying. We also saw a lot of money lent by the banks into the household sector as the housing market started to pick up. It really picked up from 2003 to 2008 with double-digit lending growth by the banks. Remember, in an economy, you can't really grow unless you create money and spend it into the economy. And there are only really two sources of new money going into the economy. They are the government, when it spends money. Often it borrows it and then it spends it, although you can take a different view, which is that you spend it and then you mop it up with borrowing. But that's one source of money creation, if you like. The second source is banks, essentially um, essentially creating money by lending money to people, and then they mop it up in term deposits. And so to get growth, you need either the government to spend, which we know this one isn't going to stimulate by the government itself, it's pulling back, and you need households to borrow and spend. The problem now, and the difference between 1990 to 1996, is that households now have a lot of debt, around about 150% of disposable income. And essentially, they can't easily borrow a lot more. Houses are now worth 7, 8, 9 times income, not 2 to 3 times income that they were in 1992, 93. And secondly, banks don't lend much to businesses anymore. Effectively, they are mostly mortgage banks. So the idea that local investors, i.e., households, and banks will fill the $64 billion hole is just not right. Because even if households wanted to borrow, and they probably could, when I say households, I'm talking about landlords, they have enormous amounts of equity, 80% equity in homes that are worth over $1 trillion. So there's no shortage of money for landlords to gear up and to buy into new houses and get the housing market with bits tacked on surging again. The difference this time, as we saw with the Reserve Bank applying the debt to income multiple controls in July of last year, is that the Reserve Bank is stopping it. And it stopped it from 2013 onwards. That's why the government of the day under Bill English and John Key had such trouble getting the economy going again. They were cutting back, and the banks were finding it difficult to lend into the economy. So when you can't have too much growth from households gearing up or businesses gearing up, where does the money come from? Well, one way to do it is to bring in investment from overseas. And we saw some investment from overseas through the 90s. A bunch of state owned assets were sold. We saw a whole bunch of companies taken off the stock market, bought out. There isn't much left to sell, really, if you were looking at just simply selling existing assets. You could sell land, but that's banned at the moment. And New Zealand First, while in the coalition government, won't allow that to be changed. So, how else do you get the money in? Well, Christopher Luxon's idea is we'll bring in money from sovereign wealth funds. That sounds good. And they certainly have plenty of money, hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars, which they could invest. And in theory, they like the idea of investing in New Zealand. The trouble here, though, is that those sovereign wealth funds actually find it quite difficult to invest in direct projects. So, new projects, so called foreign direct investment, putting money into public private partnerships. It requires a lot of analysis and work. Those assets aren't very liquid. What you'd actually prefer to do if you wanted to invest in a country is to buy government bonds. And that's the guts of the problem here. The government could invest itself by borrowing from these foreign investors. It would be much easier, faster, and cheaper. But the government has decided, for its own ideological reasons, that it wants to reduce government debt and reduce the size of government. And that's the problem here. Foreign direct investment will not fill that $64 billion hole. Neither will landlords, neither will households, neither will businesses. So the government is up against a massive headwind if it wants to continue with its tight fiscal policy. So that's the underlying mathematical flaw in the government's approach. Secondly, the government's been quite optimistic about the idea of bringing in foreign direct investment. It's creating this new thing called Invest New Zealand. But remember, we've been here before. John Key set up a very similar thing to bring in foreign direct investment into Christchurch after the earthquake, and that wasn't very successful. Secondly, sovereign wealth funds know that New Zealand has a history. And the best way to look at this is the light rail project. You might recall that between 2017 and 2020, the government was very keen on bringing in uh, sovereign wealth fund money from, firstly, our New Zealand Super Fund, and secondly, from the Quebec Public Servants Fund, the CPDQ. And this was going to be private investment in building the rail lines and all sorts of housing and various other things in Auckland. And the deal was almost over the line, but it was blocked by New Zealand First and Winston Peters. So this is the problem here. And I asked this of Christopher Luxon yesterday. Why should these sovereign wealth funds believe you that you're going to stick with the deal when your partner in coalition blocked one of these deals just a few years ago? And secondly, they've also got to look at whether the New Zealand government can be trusted to follow through on a deal with a big foreign investor or a big foreign operation. Well, last year, the government cancelled at the last minute, reneged on a deal to buy ferries from the Hyundai shipyards in South Korea, and they remember that. So this is the problem with the government strategy at the moment, and with that State of the Nation address. So, just to summarise the six things in at 6:30 here on the Dawn Chorus for Friday, January the 24th. The government is going to depend on foreign direct investment to grow the economy over the next couple of years. It really needs over $60 billion worth. It won't get it. It can't get that, fill that gap from households and businesses. And so the government's aims of getting the economy going again are going to be incredibly difficult without relaxing that fiscal policy North Star. I'm Bernard Hickey for the Kaka. This is my daily podcast that goes out to paying subscribers. But today, I'm going to make sure this goes out to everyone immediately because I think we don't have enough analysis of the government's overall fiscal strategy. And hopefully, this is useful. Thanks again to paying subscribers for the support in helping me to do this sort of work. Ka kite anō. Have a great weekend.